Whose land is it anyway? Uh, I heard an excellent video on this, which I'll put a link to below. But first, we're going to use the example of America. North America has an event of settlers coming from Europe, white settlers coming from Europe to the United States, what's going to become way later the North America, United States. And so you have these white Europeans coming, just Native Americans in place. So it's very easy to say, well, America really belongs to the Native Americans. And that makes a certain amount of sense until you ask which Native Americans. Again, then we look at their history and we find, like, we have certain tribes, we have tribal maps. But once you really start reading the history, we find that Native American tribes fought with each other. They colonized other areas. You know, they did genocide. They had slaves. You know, pretty much they were human, just like the European settlers. Now, what's different about the European settlers is they have superior weapons. And that usually changes the landscape dramatically. And, you know, in the U.S. it did. So looking at it, it's become very hard to say, well, yeah, let's return it, or, you know, it just can't be done, because the whole idea that, well, no, maybe we should look at Paleo-Indians, the prehistoric, you know, and that record is kind of confused, you know. So this idea that you can just give land back to someone doesn't make sense. Excuse me. And it makes even less sense with Israel. This is tour guide. He's a Jewish tour guide, but I'm going to say, maybe he would be offended by this, but I'm going to say he's, as far as the religious beliefs, he seems nominal. In other words, he's culturally Jewish. He's a citizen of Israel, but he doesn't, at least on the videos, express this huge faith, okay? So I'll leave it there. Maybe you'll see it and correct me, which is fine, and I'll believe him. But he gives an excellent talk about Israel when the idea of who does the land belong to. Well, again, we can go way back and find evidence of prehistoric tribes that lived there, you know, way back. You know, go back hundreds of thousands of years or whatever, and we find that there's evidence of mankind there. But really, Israel is a kind of a corridor. That's how he explained it. And, you know, looking at history, that's really true. It was a big corridor for wildlife migration too as well. But, you know, all these different empires controlled that area at different times in history. In, you know, the Byzantines, the Babylonians, the Romans, you know, all of these different people, Muslims. And so the question becomes is, if you're going to use a standard of whose land is it, if we're going to give it back, who can we give it back to? Well, the only group that's still presently existing that has a connection to the land, a long connection, is Jews. Jews are from Judea. That's one of the tribes, the southern part of Israel, it was called. Back then, Judea, Jews, that's where it comes from. Just like Arabs come from the Arabian Peninsula. They're Arabs, right? And so we can trace the connection with Jews to the land of Israel thousands of years. You know, it's easy to go back to the time of Jesus. There's a Roman occupation, but the Jews are there. You go back 1,000 years, the Jews are there. You know, we can go back longer than that. So, you know, they've got 3,000 or 4,000 years of connection to the land. And the big conflict now is these people who call themselves Palestinians, which is a nonsensical term, believe it's their land. They believe they're being occupied by these evil Jews, and that gives them the right to, you know, rape women, cut off heads of babies, burn children, or do anything they want to do because they're being so horribly oppressed. in their land. Well, it's not their land. It never was. Let's look at it. These Palestinians, Google it, you'll find out they're 99% Muslims. And when did Islam start? Now, of course, if you look at the Quran or talk to their people, they'll say, well, we were right there from the beginning, Adam and Eve. They talk about Mecca. This is the big thing, the big city, the big holy site, blah, blah, blah. It's been there forever almost, blah, blah, blah. And oops, it hasn't been. The Mecca isn't even mentioned anywhere till like the 7th century AD, not BC, AD. And, Muhammad supposedly got his revelations around 600 to 620 AD. So even if we accept that as the start of Islam, they're newcomers to the area. The Jews and Christians were already there. The Old Testament, New Testament, they'd completely been completed by the year 600. So everything's in place. And this is one of, if there was a person named Muhammad, which some people argue that he's a composite of several people. Some people even argue that he actually was taken from various people, including Christians, to amalgamate this person to be how they wanted him to be. But the simple fact is that, Islam didn't exist before. If I give them till we'll go back 100 or 200 years earlier than what some people say, and we'll say it was created, came into existence at the year 620. So like I say, that still means the Jews have been there for 2,000 years longer. Christians were there 600 years longer. So, but what's the point here? And, as much as, Muslims want to tell you about their history, they can't prove any of it. Now, if we look at, imagine if you were to find out that Jerusalem didn't even exist at the time of Jesus. It wasn't even a city. No one was there. With that prominent place name, city, you'd have to conclude that there's something seriously wrong with the New Testament, at least, and maybe the Old Testament as well. But we have archaeological evidence that Jerusalem has been a city for 5,000 years. 1,000 or so years before Jews came there and conquered it. Okay? So the whole situation again becomes, okay, how old is Mecca? You say it's, they're talking about it being at least, I think, 5,000 years old. The call of Abraham. Abraham goes down there, does some things. But there's not one archaeological artifact that dates it even back to the year 600, from what I understand. 600 AD, let alone 2000 BC. There just isn't. They've done extensive construction at Mecca, and they're doing more now, and they've come up with nothing. Israel, my goodness, it seems like sometimes all you have to do is stick a shovel in the ground somewhere and you run into something. They have an antiquities board that whenever there's construction and they hit anything, the construction stops. This team comes in and looks at what they find and decides if they can continue, or maybe they're going to pick up artifacts before the construction goes on. But in a city that, cities were built on top of each other, and Jerusalem was destroyed a bunch of times, okay, and built back on. So you've got these layers and layers, and go back far enough, and you're into, different civilizations completely than what we could call Judeo-Christian or Roman or whatever, different completely. And so, like I say, it's been there 5,000 years. So the Muslims claim that they have this claim to the land, but they can't claim they existed before 600 AD at all. There's just like no evidence. The only evidence they cite is there's a well there in Mecca. A well? Well, I don't think I mean, anyone could have made that well, and it's just not, there's not like pottery there, there's not, there's just nothing. And one of the other things that is extremely troubling for Muslims is the fact that they have this thing called the Qibla. I'm probably saying that wrong. But in other words, it pointed towards Mecca. So you go to a mosque today, there's a feature that will point towards Mecca. Well, the original mosques that were built didn't point towards Mecca. They pointed towards Petra. What? Yes. And there is some good, solid evidence that these events, this Muslim type, this Mohammed person actually lived in Petra and not in Mecca. This is an older city, has some background to it. I should say the geographical facets of it, the amount of water, different things like that, the geography described in the Quran fits Petra better than it does Mecca. And the still standing mosques that are pointing towards Petra seem to indicate that it was the original birthplace of Muhammad, not Mecca. And why was it changed to Mecca? Well, many people believe it was a political interest. In other words, that would be like saying, Jesus was really born in Lebanon. We know he was born in Lebanon. We're going to change it to Bethlehem because that goes with our story better that we want to tell. And, that's kind of what happened. A lot of people believe that's what happened, that this change of the city happened. So if we change to Petra, then at least we can get to thinking that, at least Islam goes back to 600 AD for sure. That maybe that was where that's where Muhammad actually lived, and these different events happened, and then these things were all changed later for a lot of people believe the actual, let's say, the codification, in other words, the what we believe type thing, the bedrock things that underlie Islam and what Muslims believe wasn't even solidified until 900 AD. So the idea that, that Islam was developing for 300 years and in a fluid state until 900 years AD seems like it could be very accurate. And we know, even though Muslims don't like to admit this, if you go to any of the libraries, the big museums in the world, they have Qurans there. You look at them, they're different than today's Quran. They have different verses, they have corrections. They don't agree with the one in Cairo doesn't agree with the one in London, and all these different things. The ancient books, they don't have the same number of verses. They're not this word of Allah that cannot be changed, which they believe you can't change the Quran. If I gave you a Quran and asked you to copy it over, you couldn't make a mistake. And so when we look at all of this stuff, it kind of ends up with us having a really good idea that the idea of being a Muslim was created within the 600, 900 year period and probably didn't get really firm until the year 900. And so the idea that they're saying, we have this claim to the land based on being there for, we'll even say 600, okay, we'll go back 1,400 years. With this 1,400 years connection to the land, archaeologically, Israel has, 3,000 or 4,000 years. There's no way out around it. You dig up things, you find things, and they have names of kings from the Old Testament, as in the Old Testament literature. You find this, you find synagogues, you find churches, you find all of these things. and in Jerusalem and different places, and it's just extremely rich in archaeological evidence. And I mentioned this once before, but if I was to take, let's say I had access to all the artifacts in Mecca and in Jerusalem, and I was going to spend 10 minutes on each one to look at it, I'd probably spend the rest of my life, I'm kind of old, but the rest of my life not even getting through the things in Jerusalem. Where Mecca, I'm pretty sure I'd be done in a week or so. This just, I mean, the well, that's the only thing I've heard of. And like I say, extensive. And, you know, you can't believe under any stretch of the imagination that current construction, that they're somehow destroying artifacts. That's just silly and ridiculous. Yeah, that's being done. And, you know, and that it's just that way. I mean, you can give 100 reasons why this is like that, but that's the way it is. If there's anyone that has a right to the land by we were there first, it's Israel. And when you talk about the people that Israel kicked out to get there, you know, they did conquer the land, right? Well, actually, most of those people disappeared or assimilated into the Jewish culture and gene pool. So in other words, if you're saying, well, the Canaanites should have it, well, probably you're going to find most of that Canaanite, if we could find their DNA profile, we'd probably find more of it in Jews than we would in Arabs. You know, and same with other things too. Those people got assimilated. And again, we go back to the whole thing. What does Palestinian mean? Palestinian means someone who lived in Palestine. What is Palestine? Palestine means the land of the Philistines. The Philistines lived in Crete. They came over, invaded into Israel. They were invaders from the sea. And the real, that was funny, that little thing went by. They were invaders. So if they're actually real Palestinians, which they are not, they can't be, they need to go back to Crete, not look for after Israel. And we're really certain that Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king, totally wiped out every remains of the Philistines. Philistines had a certain type of pottery and stuff, and it's gone at one time. And it references back to the time where we have records of King Nebuchadnezzar going in and destroying everything. Now, if they had survived, we would see some of that pottery influence in some of the people around them, and there's none. It's just the evidence is that all Philistines, all people from Palestine, what that term really means, were destroyed by the Babylonians. They were, you could say genocide, yeah, genocide. They were wiped out completely by the Babylonians. Or I'm sure they took some of them for slaves, and some of the population probably integrated into the Babylonians and different things like that. And yeah, and there wasn't supposed to be intermixing between Jews and non-Jews, but again, if we had some Palestinian official DNA thread, we might find more in Jews today than we find in other people who claim that. So and why was the area of Israel called Palestine? Because it was an insult when the Romans took over the area. They decided to name it after the ancient enemies of Israel. They had been long gone. Nebuchadnezzar killed them. King Nebuchadnezzar killed them. So it was an insult to put something on them, this title of their enemies. And that would be like if, China invaded us and then they named us Russia or something. I don't know if that's not even a good example, but you know what I'm saying. That sort of thing. So there we go. I'll put the video below, but I would challenge any Muslim who watches this to prove it different. Any person you think you're a Palestinian, prove it. And prove you know what that means. Come up with some archaeological evidence that you existed, your group existed before 600 or 900 AD. And now the new gimmick is, well, Muhammad, Abraham was a Muslim. What do you mean he was a Muslim? Well, being Islam means you submit to God. So Abraham submitted to God. So therefore he was the first Muslim. And it's like, what? According to that, then, Catholics and Baptists are Muslims too. We're definitely not. But according to their, Islam, we submit to God. So we must be Muslims too. But we're not. So there you go. Bye.